All right, everybody. So, before we get into this, I want to talk about the host of the debate that we're about to watch, Lex Friedman. For those who don't know, this guy is a soulless ghoul who does like podcast interviews with usually political pundits, but also with a lot of like clouded up big figures. He definitely has a decisively conservative leaning, pull, and he is extremely successful. However, if you go on a show, you're guaranteed a lot of exposure, which is why Destiny and Ben Shapiro both agreed to debate on his podcast. Now, the full debate, which came out a few days ago, is itself just really long and boring from what I've heard, which is why I've specifically selected a 20-minute clip on the topic of wokeism that they debate on, because I feel like that's the most interesting thing they talk about in all of this. I've yet to really see it, and I am like a psycho going to put a Destiny versus Ben Shapiro debate at 1.25 speed. I'm really excited to see how fast this goes, honestly. But yeah, I'm excited to see how this goes, because these are like the two memed people finally going up against each other. This has literally been like a decade in the making. It's finally happening. I genuinely don't know what else to say other than, holy shit, it's happening. Guys, I want to make it clear here right now, I do not like Lex Friedman. I think he's a little robot ghoul, and I hate how clouded up he is. But if I ever got invited on his show, I absolutely would go on there. And I mean, I'd probably talk shit, but I wouldn't talk shit hard enough to get kicked off and not get myself uploaded on his channel, because it really does seem like the current meta is going on these weirdos' podcast shows and like making them look stupid and giving their audiences a peek into an alternative worldview. And as much as I don't like a lot of what Destiny does, I've got a lot of problems with Destiny, there's no denial that better than anyone else in this space, he is going on these shows and growing his audience by bringing those people over. Like way better than I am, way better than Vosh is, Shark, or anybody in the lefty streamer space. Destiny has been going on these shows and pulling massive amounts of these people's fans away from the Red Pill sphere, from Lex Friedman, now from Ben Shapiro. Something I've noticed is, and it's always disappointing, his debate style is not as like hardcore against these people as I would expect. Like, he's not going as hard as I would like, but the result has been massive amounts of audience pull from these conservative pundits towards his audience. And while that's not necessarily a good thing in many of your eyes, I would argue the fact that he's pulling people from literal conservatism to like what you would probably see as like centrist, I would argue is like liberal, because, you know, as much as Destiny has some dog shit takes on plenty of things, like, he is absolutely left-wing in the American political Overton window, even in the European political Overton window. So yeah, my overall position on this is I'm obviously rooting for Destiny, because Destiny is the least demonic person on this show by a long shot, by like magnitudes. And if I ever go on Lex Friedman, don't be mad at me for using his platform to get more people in my audience, okay? Know now that I obviously don't endorse him, but I would absolutely get platformed by him and siphon off his fans. For sure I would. I'd be stupid not to. Anyway, let's watch.
Recently in the news, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT failed to fully denounce calls for genocide. And that rose questions about the influence of DEI programs at universities. And so maybe either looking at this or zooming.
I love this line of claims. Recently, the two heads at Harvard, I think it was, he said, failed to denounce genocide. So this has brought a lot of questioning to the concept of hiring with diversity and inclusion. I love how it's like genocide is somehow pro hiring people, somehow being pro-genocide and being pro-hiring people for diversity. Those are like the same position. Those are correlated positions in this guy's worldview. Absolute brain rot right off the bat. I love it.
Out more broadly at identity politics at universities, or identity politics, wokeism in our culture. How big of a threat is it to our culture, to Western civilization?
So obviously I'm going to say it's a huge threat.
I think you have to be. like a major league retard to believe, like, actually, internally, genuinely yourself that wokeism, quote unquote, is a threat to our society. If you actually believe that, you're either going to look back at your current views and be very embarrassed in like 3 or 4 years, or you are an actual animal, like an actual animal in a human body. You are a furry. Like you are an otherkin, and you have voting rights, and maybe you shouldn't.
The reason that I think this is a huge threat, I want to give a definition of wokeism because people are very often accused of not using wokeism properly or believing that's sort of a catch-all phrase. I don't think it's a catch-all term. I think that wokeism has its roots in postmodernism, which essentially suggests that every principle is a reflection of underlying structures of power, and that therefore any inequality that emerges under such a system is a reflection, again, of that structure of power. That used to be applied in sort of Marxist ways, the suggestion being that economic inequality was the result of misallocation of.
Basically, what he's trying to argue here in far less words and less, like, basically, also, holy shit, can I acknowledge what the fuck he's wearing right now? When did Ben Shapiro start trying to look cool? This dude's like, what, 40? And a conservative, like, pundit who is currently wearing a yarmulke because he is a, like, religious fundamentalist? He can't wear a leather This is literally...
Yo, bro, you know what's cool? Praying to Jesus. I'm high on God. Yeah, bro. What's up, fellow kids?
No wonder Ben Shapiro is, like, failing with young people, and they're all, like, migrating to neo-Nazi. I actually think Ben Shapiro might be driving young people towards Nazism, not in the way that we think. I think Ben Shapiro is really successful with, like, millennial, Gen X, and boomer conservatives, but younger conservatives and, like, even younger people in general are really put off by him, and Nazis take advantage of that, such as, you know, Nick Fuentes, and say the problem with him is that he's Jewish. So that's why you get, like, the Groyper sphere, who's really against Ben Shapiro. Those were the people who are really attacking Tom McDonald for collabing with Ben Shapiro on his new song, and calling him out for collaborating with a Jew, even the world's most racist Jew. So it was just like, you know, it's really a matter of, like, is Ben Shapiro radicalizing people towards Nazism, or are conservatives radicalized away from him towards Nazism because people who hate him on the right hate him because he's Jewish? Does that make sense? So, like, young people who think he's, like, a weird nerd who want to see a conservative dunk on him are going to find Nick Fuentes as, like, the first guy who comes up.
Power in the structure preserved by an upper crust of people who wanted to cram down exploitation on people. That was sort of the Marxist version.
Oh, anyway. Getting back to the point I was actually about to make before I got distracted by his dumbass outfit. What he's saying right now, in far less words, is if there is... What he's trying to claim right now, by implication, is that our society is a meritocracy. And anyone who, in the hierarchy that we see in our society, is born of that meritocracy. The people who are on the top because they deserve to be there and they work to be there, and the people who are on the bottom because they cannot achieve or they're not willing to work to achieve what others have. And so that is the argument they make. We're in a complete meritocracy, and they imply the reason why, say, Black people in America are extremely economically disadvantaged, they imply, is because that is the natural state of Black people in a society where there is also white people and you, like, chart out their economic achievement. They imply that things as they are, the hierarchy as we see it now, is how things are supposed to be. Now, naturally, it's always people who happen to be at the top of that hierarchy who claim that. It's never people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy claiming that hierarchy is valid, except for people who unironically, publicly claim they believe they'll be at the top of that hierarchy again, or again, not again. They'll be at the top of that hierarchy one day, delusionally. Besides that, it's only people already at the top of that hierarchy who claim we live in a meritocracy and that hierarchy is just. Not to mention, this argument is instantly destroyed by the concept of generational wealth. If your grandparents were rich, that made your parents born into a wealthy family. They inherited that wealth, and it means you'll inherit that wealth too. Not to mention, you had parents who probably went to college, who had really good schooling, a really good upbringing, who have a lot of money to spend on you, who probably don't have to work full-time to spend on you. So you've got either one or two parents spending a lot of time with you, unlike many other kids having their upbringing in America. You're not one of the... what percentage of kids is it in America? By the way, Ben Shapiro has publicly denounced any programs that would help to solve this problem. Percentage of U.S. kids going hungry. More than 13 million children faced hunger in 2022. Families with children are more likely to face hunger overall. Black and Latino children are twice as likely to face hunger. Single-parent families are more likely to face hunger as well, of course. Causes of child hunger, family low incomes. Although parents and caregivers work hard to provide for their children, low wages make it difficult to have enough money to buy food. Lack of affordable housing. Despite budgeting and saving, the high cost of housing can make it difficult for families with children to afford food and rent. Racism and discrimination. Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans are more likely to face barriers to getting food. Effects of child hunger. Poor academic performance. Children who have experienced food insecurity may have trouble focusing and learning in school. Increased health problems. Kids who don't get enough food to eat face higher risks of health conditions like anemia and asthma. Developmental differences. Hunger can change how a child's brain and body grow and affect their thinking, learning, and behavior. And then, of course, these are the things that Ben Shapiro has publicly denounced. Ending child hunger. Child food programs. We support programs that provide food to children after school, over the weekend, and during the summer. Ben Shapiro and Trump and the rest of the Republican Party are, as a party, line that you have to toe, are against free school lunches. SNAP application assistance. The right is, Republicans are actively trying to destroy SNAP. We help families understand and apply for SNAP benefits so they have extra money for buying food. Advocating for food programs. We support policies that give food to people facing food insecurity throughout programs like SNAP and TFAP. Republican-run towns all across the country right now are passing bills that make it a crime that you can be arrested for if you provide any form of support to a homeless person in the town. It was a town in Arizona that did it most recently, I believe, a small Republican town, where they made it so you can be arrested and jailed for up to a week for giving food, blankets, or shelter to a homeless person. Anything that might, quote unquote, give homeless people the idea of coming here in droves, unquote, is what the local leadership said. So when you consider that Republicans are just trying to maintain this is what they're talking about when they say the just hierarchy that we live in due to the quote unquote meritocracy that we live in. That is what Ben Shapiro is arguing right now, with a lot of words to make himself sound smart and to distract you from the fact that what he's supporting is downright demonic and evil. Ben Shapiro is the anti-Mr. Beast in everything that he stands for, and yet he has multiple times tried to ride the coattails of Mr. Beast by saying, look at the left canceling Mr. Beast for curing blind people. Meanwhile, he is against any program whatsoever that would have cured those blind people's vision impairment for free, like Mr. Beast did. There is no honesty there. The only goal that Ben Shapiro has, especially at this point in his life, is to make money and succeed. It's why he's wearing an expensive watch, a leather jacket, trying to look cool, and why he is trying to have his company, The Daily Wire, branch out into other forms of media, like with BentKey, their new animated kids service thing that they've done, their new kids streaming service for conservative kids media.
Of postmodernism, and then got transmuted into sort of a racial version of postmodernism, in which the systems of the United States are white supremacist in orientation and are perpetuated by a group of people who are, in fact, in favor of the preservation of white power and white supremacy. That is the general...
Not just... It's less so white power and white supremacy, and more so economic hierarchy. Ben Shapiro, you are one of these people. It just so happens that due to the way that America formed itself and the laws and practices that we had, that the majority of wealthy, powerful people in this country are white. Because of that, white supremacy, while it may not be all of or even most of those people's end goal, it is, for many of them, a tool to maintain the hierarchy that has put them at the top. So I'm not saying that they're all racist. Most people aren't saying that they're all racist. Simply that white supremacy is a component in how the hierarchy is kept in place. But the primary goal will be, and has always been, the securing of financial, like resources on the part of the 1%, the upper tier of that hierarchy in America.
Generalized theory of critical race theory, as proposed by, for example, Gene Stefanczyk and Richard Delgado in their book on critical race theory, that has taken a softer form that we refer to as DEI. The key in DEI is the E, meaning equity. So equity is a term that does not mean equality. People mix it up. Equality is the idea.
So for those who don't know, there's a really good political art cartoon that's pretty popular. You see it around online a lot. That kind of lays out like the difference between equality and equity, right? So under equality, it's the idea that no matter who you are, you get the same thing. Now, obviously, we don't live in an equal country. We do not get equal opportunity when we're born. We know this because of like the rate of childhood food insecurity we just read about. These are stats and data you cannot argue are not real. These kids do not have the same size box as like other people, okay? But I guess the way to depict that is like the kid being shorter, I guess. So equality would be you give everybody the same box in terms of like some form of governmental support if the right was in favor of any, right? But obviously the really tall guy doesn't need a box to see the game. You know, obviously. The kid in the middle definitely could use it, but, you know, it's... You know, he's doing fine. He's the lucky one. He definitely needed it. This guy didn't really need it. But this kid doesn't really, like, get to see the game. And what Ben Shapiro is doing is basically if this guy said, this guy needs to try harder to see over the wall at the game because we're able to see over the wall at the game. Why can't he? But of course, the height can be a representation of, you know, economic stability that comes from generational wealth, generally affected strongly by race, strongly affected by gender as well. Like, obviously, if you're born into a household as like a daughter and you've got like two brothers, your schooling is likely going to be far less prioritized than that of the brothers in the household. It is a very common tendency for daughters to be given like basically expected to just get married and get an MRS degree or whatever, while the boys are expected to go to college and make something of themselves, right? They got to go make something of themselves. They got to go provide, you know? And so when you consider that even from get-go, the expectations are different, some people are metaphorically in this kid's position. A lot of people, technically most people, are in this position. Hold on. U.S. poverty line. For an individual in the U.S., the poverty line is $14,580 per year. That is unlivable, obviously, for even a single person to live off of 14,000. Like that poverty line is like so below unlivable. It's insane. The poverty line, like if it was like 20,000 or 30,000, it would still be unlivable. $14,580 a year for an individual is not livable in 2024. You cannot live off of that. I don't believe you could. Maybe in some places with really cheap housing you could, and if you really stretch, like maybe if you find like someone to bunk up with, roommates, you can, but we're like assuming like people should be able to, if they work a job, they go to work and they have a place that is their own, they can't afford that. They can't afford to have their own place, most likely, and to like support themselves. For a family of two, the poverty line is $19,720 a year. That is insanely low as well. You could not support a family on twice that. of 2. Family of 3, it's 24,000. Still quite low. Like, really, the poverty line is insanely low. Now, if we look up percentage of people below U.S. poverty line, the official poverty rate in 2022 was 11.5%, with 37.9 million people in poverty. So that is an insane amount of people. Over 1/10 of the country is represented by this kid. But remember, that's the poverty line we've already established is criminally low. If it's 1/10 of people in America are below that insanely low fucking line we went over there, imagine if we'd got an actually reasonable poverty line set, how high the percentage of Americans would fall below it. Imagine how high that percentage would be. So what Ben Shapiro says is wrong here is the idea of the state using tax dollars, those things that we pay to the state to do things for us with, in order to make it so that there are benefits for those that are born into situations in which they have less opportunities so that they do have equal opportunity. This is equity. Now, obviously, this image does leave a lot out. Obviously, it's not that, like, you're just given everything and you're instantly able to see the game, like seeing the game being, like, succeeding in life, right? The idea is that you would have equal opportunity to succeed. Equity is when you have equal opportunity. And that is what the left argues for and what Ben Shapiro is about to try to demonize.
That we all ought to have equal rights, that we all ought to be treated equally by the law. Equity is the idea that if there is an inequality that emerges from any system, it is therefore due to discrimination. And the best way to tell whether somebody has been victimized is by...
This is definitionally untrue. Equity is the idea that if there is any inequality, then it must be due to discrimination. No. Equity is the idea that any inequality should be remedied with equal opportunity. Like, whatever inequality there is should be remedied, is the idea of equity. It's literally as simple as that. He can't even state what the definition of equity is without trying to turn it into a ideological thing.
End of their race. And we can tell whether you're a member of an oppressed group or an oppressor group by the intersectional identity that you carry and by the nature of your group's success or failure predominantly along economic and power lines in American life. This means that if one group is predominantly successful economically, they must be a member of the victimizing class. And the only corrective for that would be, as Ibram X. Kendi likes to suggest, effectively...
He's basically trying to, in an overcomplicated way, say the left says that being white means that you are privileged over a non-white person, and so that means you are, like, by definition, you are benefiting from some form of inequality. And he's going to try to use examples, no doubt, of people who are white and straight and male who have it really rough, and people who are, say, black women who are trans and gay who have it quite well and are successful celebrities, to say, look, there is no inequality. This idea is completely false. But obviously this is not, like, exceptions do not defeat the rule.
Anti-racist policy is racism in the service of destroying racism. That you're going to have to discriminate on the basis of race in order to correct for discrimination that's baked into the system.
So notice that wording, by the way. You have to discriminate by race to correct the inequality in the system. What he's describing there would be like a program run by the government that specifically gives grants to schools with overwhelmingly non-white students. Like, if there was a bill to do that, to give, like, grants to schools across America for more funding with that had majority non-white students to try to combat the extremely low quality of education in inner city schools due to the fact that those schools are funded by property taxes from redlined districts that are really low income tax, and so those schools have really low funds, and so the education is worse. The teachers are paid worse. The textbooks are older and fucked up and out of date. There's like the hardware is out of date if there's computers. The curriculum is going to be backwards. The teachers aren't going to care about teaching it. The students are certainly not going to give a fuck about learning. Yeah, it's just like the Republicans would fight against a bill like that, like their lives depended on it. And at the same time, they would argue, just like Ben is right here, why don't we pass a bill that gives a grant to every school in America, every public school in America? When obviously, because there is a massive issue when it comes to feeding and educating kids that are in low-income, non-white areas. That is a massively disproportionate problem in the country right now, and it would be very, very effective if we targeted that, if we targeted those groups to try and fund their schooling. However, I do agree personally that programs like this would be far more effective if they filtered based on income and class position, like income, rather than race. Obviously, whether you're white, black, trans, gay, a woman, or a man, if you're in America and you have like a really fucked economic standing and you can't like make it because of your like things you can't control and you don't have the same opportunities, then you should have that remedied by the state that we pay into with our tax money, no matter what your race is. And so I do think a class-based form of like, say, affirmative action, class-based form of stimulus, class-based form of whatever program it might be, to try and give equal opportunity and equity would be better than one that's based on race. Ben Shapiro is going to try to pretend like no one is making that argument on the left when most people on the left agree with it. And it's actually most like, what is it called? Affirmative action policies are like from the early 2000s and 90s when progressive thought was, yes, a lot less developed than it is today, where you did have a lot more people in positions of power at these colleges and in these states that were trying to be progressive. And so what they would do is like say, oh, you know what? Here's how we'll fix the problem with low admissions for non-white people in colleges. We'll make it so they have to accept a certain amount of non-white people per year. And then, of course, that ends up resulting in like a massive influx of white women, I think it was. And no, it was already excelling Asian and black women who ended up like over benefiting from a ton of these affirmative action policies where they weren't really intended. Because I believe for like Asian students, there was already like massive amounts of like excelling there. So like affirmative action wasn't necessary. And the just saying if you're not white, like there needs to be a certain amount of non-white students meant that like these colleges would just bring in a bunch of Asian students and accept them. And when, you know, very clearly based on the economic, you know, spreadsheet of things, the policy was clearly intended to make it so there'd be more Hispanic, Indigenous, and black students getting accepted due to the fact that their test scores and their applications, their what is it called? What is it called? The shit you do to put on your resume for college that's like meant to make you look like a better application, like volunteer hours, like internships, extra credit classes, like AP classes you took for classes, extracurricular. Yeah, basically all the extracurriculars, thank you, minimum volts, that you would include on there. Like, if say, for example, you are a black man who is born into a red-lined neighborhood, many such cases, statistically, you are very likely to have pretty much the hardest possible upbringing you can have in America, period. Like, that's pretty much as rough as it gets. Statistically, you will end up in prison or dead. Like, before you will end up, like, financially secure. It's actually insane. That is that is how low, that is how insanely low the upward mobility economically is for the average black man in America. There is effectively no upward economic mobility. The opportunities are non-existent. Okay? So when those opportunities don't exist, or they are very sparse, yeah, it is fair to create programs that would try to fix that, to try to solve that problem, especially when those issues tie back to racism that was literally systemic and written in the law less than 100 years ago, when, like, that guy's grandpa or mom or even was alive, you know? Like, if you're a 24... let me think. Let me do math really fast. Segregation ended in the 60s for the most part. Some states carried it on to, like, the 70s, I believe. But, like, let's ballpark it 60s. It's only been 50 years since segregation was ended. So, yeah, like, if you're, like, 30 and you're black and your parents were obviously American as well, chances are your parents went to school when segregation was a thing. My mom's like 40 something, and she went to school in Florida, obviously, and she said they still had the signs up over the bathrooms from segregation and over the water fountains from segregation. Obviously not enforced, but they hadn't taken the signs down still. They were still up. My mom was born in 63. In that case, your mom would have gone to, like, very early schooling when segregation was still being practiced. Yeah. Like, this isn't long ago history by any means. Like, if you're a 30-year-old black guy in America, your parents, and certainly probably your parents and definitely your grandparents, couldn't buy a nice house as you would consider them today in a quote-unquote nice neighborhood as you could consider them today legally, because the banks would not loan to them. And it was completely legal to discriminate for house sales and renting. And so those neighborhoods were basically 100% white, and that has not changed over time. And it's not because black people aren't capable of, like, getting themselves out of that rut. It's because some people, not saying white people, but some people have fought desperately politically to keep them there.
That's incredibly dangerous. It leads to a victim-victimizer narrative that is unhealthy for individuals and terrible for societies. It relieves people of individual responsibility, and it destroys the very notion of an objective metric by which we can decide meritocracy. And meritocracy is the only system human beings have ever devised that has positive externalities in literally any area of life. Every other distribution of wealth, power, done along other lines.
Oh, sorry. Correction. It was white women and Asian students who benefited most from the affirmative action that became common in the early 2000s and 90s. Current affirmative action, as you would call it, I guess you could call it now. So, for example, California recently got a bunch of heat from the right, ironically. By recently, I mean like 2019, 2020, when they actually, like, the Democrat governor and Democrat ruler, like, leadership got rid of the affirmative action law in California for schools and hiring, or for like universities, not hiring, and replaced it with one that was more class-based instead. The right didn't follow up with talking about the class-based new system, which is far better and far more in line with what the left agrees with now, because if they did, I think a lot of even conservative viewers would be like, well, that makes sense to me. If they're not making it race-based, because a lot of people see Ben Shapiro talk about how the left is, like, racializing any form of economic suffering, and they think that's their issue with the left. That's their issue with the left on this particular topic, when it's not what the left actually believes.
That is not having to do with merit has negative externalities. Every system having to do with merit has...
We do not live in a meritocracy. We very much do not live in a meritocracy. I don't... If anyone thinks that, I would love to have them on stream to talk about it.
Positive externalities, because presumably the most effective and useful people are going to succeed under those systems. That's the very basis of a meritocracy. And the externalities of that mean that other people benefit from the meritorious and excellent performance of those people.
Maybe it would be good to get your comments your old stomping ground, Harvard. Do you think the president of Harvard should have been fired?
I mean, I think she should have been fired not over the plagiarism allegations. I think she should have been fired based on her performance just at that congressional hearing. If the word black had been substituted for Jew in that statement by Elise Stefanik that she was asking about, or trans, or literally any other minority in America, maybe with the exception of Asian, then the answer would have been very different coming from Cloudy and Gay. With that said, I don't think the firing of Cloudy and Gay really accomplishes very much. Meaning, did she get what she deserved? Sure. Does that mean that the underlying DEI equity-based system has been in any way severely damaged? No. I think that this is a way for universities, this is true for Liz McGill-Penn also, to...
What really frustrates me is that there are tons of people in the, like, especially college sphere. This is mostly not like doesn't have anything to do with colleges or like the like higher education community, but like the fact that so many college students who are making up so much of like the college like lefty sphere, they're young, right? I mean, hell, most of them are still teenagers and their brains haven't fully developed yet. And so this leads to a lot of tribalism, right? It's not uncommon. You see this on Twitter a lot, and it happens a lot in college spaces from what I've heard too, politically, where like you get into a friend group because you agree with a few ideas, or maybe you've had your eyes open to a few ideas, and then you just start to agree with that friend group on everything as sort of like a point of like as a point no matter what. Like that's just what you do as a point of principle. You go with your friends on whatever thing they believe or politically align with. And I think that's pretty common in a lot of these spheres, and it leads to a lot of bubbles forming. And in those spheres, you can see a lot of cringe stuff get repeated and become popular, right? Like the woke scold stuff is pretty popular in these like college progressive spaces. And I'm not saying all college progressive spaces are like this, but it's definitely there. And I think it just has to do with the fact that a lot of these people are young, they're not fully developed, and their politics are far from fully developed. They've got the spirit, but, you know, they're not all there yet. They haven't learned everything yet. They're just learning about the world now, and they don't know enough yet to know how much they don't know. And I think that's true of everybody. And I think the older you get, the more you realize you don't know shit, and you need to constantly speak with the knowledge and the constant implication clear to everyone that you don't know everything, and you can you're not trying to tell people that what you're saying is the truth, end all be all, turn your brain off, listen to me, and only accept what I'm saying. People like Ben Shapiro want you to do that, though. Ben, if we lived in a meritocracy, you would have made it as a writer through your hard work. Ben Shapiro is living proof we don't get what we want. Actually, that is true. Ben Shapiro has actually put in a fair amount of work as a writer, and his books have not succeeded at all. He stopped writing because it stopped being in any way financially successful for him. If we lived in a meritocracy, the hard work he put into those books, or any ghostwriter that wrote them, would have been rewarded, but it wasn't. Why not? I thought we lived in a meritocracy. We don't live in a meritocracy, obviously. Generational wealth is a thing. Elon Musk exists.
Basically, throw somebody overboard as the sacrifice to maintain the underlying system that continues to predominate in American universities, where they spend literally billions of dollars every year on DEI initiatives and diversity hires and diversity administrators and all of this. I mean, one of the costs of education escalating is in the massive administrative function that is now undertaken by universities.
My understanding is just like how the right freaked the fuck out about like safe spaces in colleges. My understanding is like diversity managers, whatever he said, are very much making a mountain out of a molehill as far as conservatives go. It's a nothing thing. So for those that don't know, safe spaces in colleges and schools, what they actually were was basically a study hall, a quiet place you could go to study or just chill out, where you had to kind of keep your voice down and just sort of like be chill. If you've ever been to a college campus, they're not like insanely rowdy or anything. It's not like an episode of Community or whatever, but like it's definitely a pretty hyper place. And for people with social anxiety, or people who just want a quiet place to study, or maybe someone who's just gotten some bad news or just got broken up with over text by their boyfriend and wants to like run to a quiet place to like, you know, chill out for a minute away from everybody. That's basically what safe spaces are. They're basically a little quiet study hall area from what I've heard, usually in libraries, but the right heard about safe spaces in colleges, and they tried to make this big narrative about how college students become these softies that can't handle anyone disagreeing with them. So they've made safe spaces, which were literally just little study zones in college libraries that blew up into nothing. And the right was like going against this shit hard back in 2016, 2017, by the way. It's pretty much a repeat of the same thing that happened with that one litter box thing. Remember when the right, like everybody on the right was talking about how that one school had litter boxes in the bathrooms for students who were furries, but then that was completely not real. There was no evidence and it got proven 100% wrong. And the right just said, oops, and never talked about it again. Except they didn't say oops, they just never corrected. Like, they really took no L on that, because they just refused to acknowledge that their entire story they created a massive media buzz about was complete bullshit. It's just the same thing. It's the same stuff every time.
As opposed to teaching and cost of dorms and such.
You guys probably agree on a lot of this, right?
Kind of, maybe, yeah. I don't...
So, I don't like Destiny's politics on a lot of stuff, but I know for a fact that Destiny does not agree with a lot of what he just said here. What Destiny's doing here, and I'm not making excuses for like his cringe takes that he has, but what he's doing here is actually pretty smart. He is not trying to win an argument with these guys. He is trying to win over the audience. Both Lex Fridman's audience and Ben Shapiro's massive audience. Destiny is being framed as like a leftist, liberal, progressive, woke, whatever, by Lex Fridman and Ben Shapiro. Whether you agree with that or not, to the conservative viewers of these guys' audience, Destiny is an insane leftist, wacko, socialist, communist, crazy. When he comes on here and doesn't disagree that hard with them, but actually provides alternative explanations and actually makes it seem like he understands these issues better than Ben Shapiro or Lex Fridman do, what happens is their fans migrate to his audience. If you've noticed, Ben Shapiro's audience, or not Ben Shapiro, Destiny's audience has gotten a lot more like conservative lately, and that like he has a lot more conservatives watching him despite his politics remaining mostly the same. The reason for that is he's pulled in tons of red pillars and tons of fans from like Lex Fridman and other podcaster types by using this strategy on their shows. By not going super hard, not necessarily just like agreeing with them 100%, but not necessarily disagreeing with them. Forcing them to have a conversation with you that's fairly cordial, so that their fans think you're actually kind of a chill guy. Maybe they should check out your content. And then when they come check out your content, they're getting exposed to far more radically progressive stuff than what you were saying on the podcast. It's a little bit dishonest, but it's the same type of strategy the right uses, and it works. For all my criticisms of Destiny, it works. Look at his Social Blade.
I don't know what makes things do this, but it feels like we can never like have a good thing and then have it end as a good thing. Things always get taken to their extreme, and then we have to fight on those extremes. Like, I would argue that back in my day, we called it SJW, Social Justice Warriors, before it became woke, like 2013 onwards, whatever. Like, there are aspects to wokeism that I think are good. Like, I like the additional representation that we have in media now. I like how, as much as people complain about the internet and how it's regulated, that there are way more groups that are represented on the internet, whether we're talking...
Notice how he's not going on the attack here? Like, to an audience of conservatives, what they're expecting is for him to attack Ben Shapiro. And look, Ben Shapiro is even not liking the response being like chill and like cordial. What they're expecting is a screeching, raving, woke maniac. Instead, they're getting a guy who's like, yeah, I think I agree with you on a few of those things, but I actually like a lot of the things that these woke things have brought about. Like, I think progressivism and like diversity has actually made like media and schooling a lot better in some ways. He's going to explain that. He's going about it in a more conversational way than a debate way. And in this format specifically, when you are being platformed by figures that are way bigger than you with hostile audiences to you, the best thing you can possibly do is shatter their expectations and basically keep the mask on a little bit. I feel like if I did this strategy that Destiny's doing on in his exact position, you guys would get mad at me, which is why I'm explaining to you all right now that he's actually doing the right thing here. This is the most practically effective way to siphon viewers away from conservative demagogues towards a moderately less conservative, at least I think you guys would agree, figure and worldview.
X, the platform formerly known as Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I think in some ways, or whether we're pushing, like women's achievements in school and in the wider workforce, I think that these are all good things. The issue that you run into is people don't ever have a stopping point, and I think people kind of get lost in this woke for woke's sake thing, where we start to see these very weird warpings of these like academic, I guess, arguments that are used for really horrible things.
Yeah, so what he's saying right now is the argument I was going to make before I got stun locked. It really upsets me that these communities in like colleges have these young people that don't have fully developed political views because they can say and do some pretty crazy woke scoldy cringe shit, like saying white people are all evil and stuff, right? Those people exist. They do. They're a very loud minority, to be clear, but they exist. And when they do that shit, whether we like it or not, the right magnifies their behavior and strawmans the entire left into them being the left's representation. Who remembers when every single person would think of, like, liberal, and the first thought that came to mind was, like, who remembers this? Who remembers when this was the left's representation online? Okay, this actually goes hard. But yeah, like, there would be, like, one lefty who would do something cringe or, like, get clipped in a way that would look cringe out of context oftentimes, and the right would signal boost that and be like, this is the entire left. This is a disease that's spreading, and this is the representation of the left. This is a mascot of the left, basically. And, there are countless other examples, obviously. Well, actually, not really that many. There's like 5 that have been constantly repeated over and over and over and over again, but you all know what I mean. 1 or 2 examples of people on the left being cringe, and we'll never hear the end of it. Yet somehow, QAnon Shaman did not have the same level of cultural impact as Trigglypuff did. The fact is, the left can't meme. There is some truth to that. It's not that the left can't meme, it's that the left chooses not to meme. I feel like the left thinks it's above memeing sometimes. We should have turned every single instance of a conservative pundit being embarrassing or evil or wrong into an unforgettable meme. Milo Yiannopoulos talking about how, like, young boys having sex with, like, grown men, aka statutory rape, is actually good for young gay boys. When he said that, that should not have been something he was able to recover his career from like he did. That shouldn't be something that half of you in chat didn't even know he said until I just said he said it. Because I imagine I'm about to see a bunch of people in chat say, what? What the fuck? Yeah, he said that. And the fact that most of you guys don't know is a failure of the left. Culturally, online.
So, for instance, I think that you can talk about in the United States things like white supremacy or things like oppression of certain demographics, especially with like Jim Crow laws and pre-Jim Crow. And you can even talk about effects from that. But then when you run into this weird world where we've kind of warped these things so that like not only is white supremacy still as present today as it ever has been, well, actually, black people and other minorities can't even be racist. They don't have the power to because we're going to use a different definition of racism. And we can only talk about punching up as opposed to punching down.
Yeah, a lot of people that are like super radical, like woke skull types in the lefty sphere, in like college campuses and online, believe that you can't be racist towards white people. That racism equals prejudice plus power, meaning that like because non-white people basically don't have any prejudice or to like instill against other people, against white people, and they don't have power to like inflict over white people or whatever. That means they can't be racist. When obviously the actual definition of racism is the discrimination based on race of people, like, in a negative sense, right? So, yeah. It's hard. It's basically the right taking individuals who represent the left in a very poor way and using them as a straw man. Simple as that. They'll never stop doing it, and I think the left should do it more.
We're actually going to say it's totally okay for these.
Because to be fair, if the left did it, it wouldn't be as dishonest. Because like QAnon Shaman, his politics represent a pretty substantial amount of the Republican voter base right now, according to the polling at least.
People to say or do whatever they want, and it's never bad. But like white people who have always been the oppressors, even if you're like a trailer park guy whose family's addicted to meth, you have all this privilege, et cetera, et cetera. I think that you run into these issues where wokeism, it starts off as like a really good idea, and I would argue has achieved really good things, especially in regards to like women's education and everything. And then it just gets so academia-y, so there's a word there, academic, whatever, where you take something and you put it into school too much, and then it comes out as some Frankenstein, cancer baby of like horrible things, such that today when I'm reading stuff, and I know Ben is the same way, like if I even hear somebody say the word like anti-racism, I'm probably ignoring every other thing you have to say. If you utter the word like colonial anything, I'm probably going to say you probably don't have anything good to say. Yeah, a lot of it is just
as much as you guys are probably going to cringe at that is most people's reaction now, and I think something a lot of lefties have a problem with is knowing how to speak to an audience, knowing how to recognize what audience they're speaking to, and knowing how to filter their rhetoric to that audience. And even when the content creators attempt to do so, you end up getting a massive horde of people canceling them for it. Vosh recently got canceled super bad for this. He put out a tweet thread that basically amounted to him saying, "Men suffer under the patriarchy too." Radfem Twitter went so... Oh my god, he got his shit pushed in by Radfem Twitter. They are so goddamn mad. They are so pissed at him because, they're just, like, super radical, like, hyper obsessed with the idea of only seeing the most radical form of their politics repeated. You can't speak to an audience. You can't try to appeal to an audience in a way that doesn't necessarily 100% align with the most fanatic version of what you believe in. You have to 100% toe the line 100% of the time, or you're going to get clipped and you're going to get canceled,
taken way too far. But you know what I will blame on some of this is I will blame conservatives for some of this. Because I think one issue that happens, and I think Ben might even agree with me here too, is
True.
I think there's two huge problems that have happened in the United States. I think
a vast majority of it is a reaction to the the massive ramping up in attacks against these groups by the right.
Broadly speaking, is that one, we become more different than we ever have been, and two, we become more similar than we ever have been. And when I say this, what I mean is that like we're splitting off into these groups, and then these groups are enforcing this insane homogeneity between these two separate groups. And I think one of these schisms has been conservatives' reluctancy to participate in things related to higher education. So for a long time, conservatives are saying like, oh, the educational institutions are against us. Rush Limbaugh talks about how evil the colleges are and blah, blah, blah. And then what happens is conservatives are less and less willing to engage in them. So then you get this scenario or this environment where everybody that's engaged in academia on the administrative side are fucking insane. they're like even more so too. And I also want to draw a distinction between like the administrators and the faculty, because oftentimes when you're reading story after story after story of like all of these insane admins that are pushing further and further left, usually the faculty is fighting against it. A lot of the tenured professors, a lot of people in their departments say, hold on, well, we actually don't agree with this. But I feel like because conservatives for so long have demonized these institutions rather than
the fact that conservatives push... What conservatives do is they push the demonization of higher education on their audiences and encourage kids not to go to college, which means they're less likely to get introduced to that bubble of progressive thought. But it also means that bubble of progressive thought that is in those colleges is far more likely to solidify. It is good to have conservatives go to college. Not only does that introduce people with alternative worldviews to, mix things up, which is always a good thing. College is about experimenting and learning new ideas and arguing with people. I mean, that's literally what the whole thing is. It's about finding out who you truly are, like that college age / college experience. And so, like, it's a good thing to have conservatives go to college, but for the right, it's a bad thing because A, generally when a conservative youth goes to college, they end up becoming progressive, and B, they want the colleges to become more radically crazy progressive. They want more stories like this one that can make higher education look bad so they can feed the loop. They can feed the cycle. Ben Shapiro is very aware of the problem Destiny's pointing out, and he doesn't like that Destiny is getting this meta. The audience, I think, is going to be quite compelled by what Destiny's saying here.
Like critically evaluated them and tried to like have like honest critique and engagement, that they've just like completely broken off. And when you only have a bunch of lefties or righties together, all they'll do is they'll veer off like even more into their insane directions. I feel like that's a big problem that we run into in the country, to where conservatives have totally broken off some conversations, broken away from, where they won't participate in them anymore. And then the people that you have left just run as far to the left as possible.
Certainly when you look at certain institutions, I think that one of the things that people on both sides of the aisle are constantly looking at is, has the institution suffered such capture that there is just no capacity to fix it? And when you talk about the universities, I'm not going to blame conservatives for the failure of the universities, because they haven't been present in major positions at universities since effectively the late 1960s.
When Ben Shapiro talks about this, by the way, he is also including any academic studies that, well, all the academic studies, I should say, that disprove his claims about the world. Things like the idea that sex and gender are the same thing. There's a massive consensus of research that says that's not the case. When you bring that up to him in a live format, he says those institutions have been corrupted by woke demagogues. So he's basically arguing against any institution that would have the authority to make a true statement, or what you could reasonably argue is a true statement about the world, by claiming they disagree politically with me, and thus their conclusion must be wrong. It must be influenced by their political disagreement with me, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. Sometimes the only evidence there is that they politically disagree is that their outcome, their conclusion, their consensus is different than their conclusion.
And you can go read Shelby Steele's work on this, where he talks about how, he's now a conservative black person. He was a liberal black person at the time. He was actually quite a radical black activist at the time in the 60s. And he talks about walking into the office of liberal administrators who were largely on his side with regard to civil rights, and being a radical, him claiming that the systems of the university were inherently broken, were inherently wrong, unfixable. And he talks about this, it's a very evocative episode, where he's talking about how he's smoking. And as he's smoking, the ash is growing more and more, and the ash falls down on this very expensive carpet. And the president of the university, who's listening to him rant and rave, Shelby Steele says, I thought he was going to say something about this. I mean, I was wrecking like $1,000 carpet in his office, being a jackass. And instead, I could see him wilt inside. I could see him collapse. He didn't have the institutional credibility or the intellect or sort of the spiritual strength to just say, listen, I agree with you on some of these things, but you're acting like a jackass. And what you see in the late 1960s.
Well, it's also possible that he was just not a big fan of confrontation, and like he just, like, a guy walking in and like big dicking him by just like smoking a cigarette and letting ash fall onto the carpet, like intimidated him a bit. It's also possible, potentially. Regardless though, what is this argument? The idea that like college administration are so scared to even like enforce basic rules to like someone who's in a minority group that they, I don't even know. That was normal in the 60s? Wait, is this story from the 60s? Is Ben trying to claim that, like, schools were afraid to be racist towards black people in the 60s? And that he was breaking a rule by smoking a cigarette in a school in the 60s? Or a college in the 60s? He said that, didn't he? I think he did. Maybe not. Take that with a grain of salt.
60s and early 1970s is, in fact, the collapse of these institutions.
Oh, yeah, 60s and 1970s, okay.
To the point where, by the time I was going to college, there was this radical disproportion between conservatives and liberals. And the problem is that when it comes to a system like the universities, basically you have to separate the universities off into two separate categories.
Yeah, so smoking in colleges was normal back then, and that story sounds like bullshit, because in the 60s, there's no way colleges were afraid to, like, offend a black student. Like, there was no woke mind virus in the 1960s, if there ever was one, okay?
One is STEM, where the universities are still pretty damn good. American universities, when it comes to STEM, are still leading universities in the world. Harvard's main creations these days are coming from actual hard science fields. Then you have the liberal arts field, in which you basically have a self-perpetuating elite, because that's actually how dissertations work. If you have somebody who's very far to the left and you decide that you're going to write a dissertation on the history of American gun rights, the chances that that is going to be approved by your dissertation advisor are much lower than if you happen to write something that tends to agree with the political positions of your dissertation advisor. Now, listen, I think there are open and tolerant professors, even in the liberal arts.
Does he know how writing a dissertation works for college? That's not just true. Okay, can I tell you what a friend of mine did recently? So I've got a friend group that is very much not like they all they know is I'm a political YouTuber, and like occasionally they check in and see my sub count and they're like, holy shit, god damn, I forgot you're like kind of a big deal. But they're very much not tuned into the politics world or the YouTube world or anything like that. Okay, but I have a friend, and she's a trans girl. She joins the Discord, and mind you, the last thing on her mind was what I do for a living. And she ends up asking, do any of you guys in here know anything about, like, trans healthcare? And I was just like, I might know a thing or two about that topic. I might have a line of work that's potentially had me study on that particular topic. And so I obviously told her, like, that's my, like, part of my job is, like, talking about trans issues quite frequently, like trans healthcare, access to it and everything. And so she basically explained to me that her plan is she has to write her college dissertation, and she decided that her college professor isn't super progressive, isn't super conservative, just fairly middle of the road. But her goal was to, because she's trans, write a dissertation about trans healthcare access. Not because like obviously she cares about that topic, but not because that's like something she really thinks her dissertation's going to change the world about, but because she knows that if she as a trans person writes a dissertation about a topic that is so like important to trans people personally, the teacher will feel a moral compulsion to give a higher grade on the dissertation. Like there would be some sort of guilt tripping that would go on there. Like you'd feel bad if you gave like a trans person a bad grade on their entire project they did on trans healthcare, right? Like it was a bit of a life hack situation. So I helped a little bit with that. Not like in a big way, just kind of sent a couple of like medical sources that I use to back up my arguments. Just the same shit that I'm always repeating to you guys because I've got all that stuff just saved and on hand ready to copy paste over. So it was pretty funny interaction. I thought that was pretty hilarious. So I guess there is a shred of truth here in that like you can definitely play on a professor or like a member of faculty's biases when it comes to your like dissertation or anything that you do as far as a project for college, if it's just down to the the professor to grade. And generally you'll have a pretty good chance of getting a high grade if you play to the biases of the professor. That's just generally how it goes. Like, it doesn't even have to be a political thing. Like, if you know that your professor is super into, like, Russian folklore, for example, and he asks you to write a book report, and you decide to write one about a Russian folk story, I think, your chances of getting a higher grade, regardless of whether or not there's some flaws there, you're going to get probably an extra point or two just for the topic, probably more. It's just a natural thing you realize when you're in college is that playing to the biases of your professor will get you better grades.
These universities. I went to these universities, right? I went to UCLA, I went to Harvard Law School. When I was at Harvard Law School, one of my favorite professors was Lani Guinier. Lani Guinier, they tried to appoint her, I believe, Secretary of Labor under Clinton, and she was too liberal, and she got rejected. So she was like a full-on communist. By the time I went there, she was great. We had debates every day. It was wonderful. She used to write me recommendations for my legal jobs after we left. Randall Kennedy, I don't agree with him very much. Randall Kennedy was a terrific professor. There are some professors who are like this. Unfortunately, there tends to be, in these echo chambers, more and more ideological conformity that is rigorously enforced, and it is by left on left. So, for example, when I was at Harvard Law School, the president of the university was another president who ended up being ousted, Larry Summers. Larry Summers had been the Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, and he made the critical error of suggesting that perhaps the dearth of women in hard sciences in prestigious positions was due to possibly two factors that people were refusing to talk about. One was the possibility that women actually didn't want to be in hard sciences at nearly the rates that men do, which happens to be true. And two was the distribution of STEM.
Yep, so I figured this was what he was going to say. The argument is that the reason why women see a lower representation in STEM fields is that they don't want to go into STEM fields. Now, I hope Destiny pushes back on this because I've heard him make this argument before, but it is just the reality of it. What people pursue is heavily influenced by their upbringing. And the reality is that the vast majority of the time, American women are not, as like when they're young, when they're little girls from like a very young age, they are not generally pushed into STEM from any like angle. Usually, you don't usually have parents encouraging their daughter to get into a STEM field. Usually it's like, I hope she finds like a wealthy man who can provide for her to marry, that kind of thing. You don't usually see them expect them to get into extracurricular activities like sports that could get them scholarships to college. You don't even see them expected to go to college. You oftentimes don't see them like pushed into like those interests in the forms of like media. Like sci-fi was heavily pushed to boys for a long time. Computers and tech related things in that realm were heavily pushed towards and advertised towards boys for a very long time, starting in the 80s, notably, when that big boom happened. Video games, which come with a lot of tech know-how. You just kind of, being a gamer comes with in the territory. You just learn a lot about computers and tech as part of the territory. It's just kind of something that happens if you're a big-time video game player. And so because girls were not really pushed into playing games as much as boys were, you don't see them knowing as much about tech as boys tend to. Now, obviously, this is changing, something the right is complaining about with the wokeification of games, right? However, go back in the day, like, I think about it, and I don't even remember, like, having video games pushed on me, right? Like, just from as early as I can remember, I was playing video games with my uncles and having fun doing it. Like, I looked up to my uncles to a degree, so I probably, like, thought, okay, yeah, this is, what I'm supposed to be doing for fun. And I also enjoyed doing it. And video games are fun. Men and women find video games equally fun. This is objectively true. However, what's been very clear is that things like video games, the STEM field, whatnot, you're just not pushed into it if you're a young girl as much as you are if you're a young boy. And what you're pushed into, or what's made attainable to you, or made to look attainable to you when you're young, is what's going to guide you into adulthood. And so as this has changed, we have seen a pretty staggering rise in the amount of women involved in STEM. Like, how can Ben Shapiro say women don't want to be a part of STEM when we're seeing a stark increase in women being a part of STEM when there are changes made that make it easier for them to get involved in STEM? Is Ben trying to argue that they don't want it because they don't, quote-unquote, try hard enough to get into STEM fields? I think that's what he's trying to imply.
IQ, right, which is something that you certainly were not allowed to talk about. The idea that the men's bell curve when it comes to IQ, particularly on STEM subjects, tends to be shallower than the women's bell curve. So when you get to the very end of the bell curve, what you tend to see is a lot of really dumb guys and a lot of really smart guys. And so when you're talking about the top universities, maybe that has something to do with the disproportion. And he's trying to explain that to say that our systems are not discriminating. If we end up with more men than women, maybe more men are applying and more men are qualified. That's quite. He was ousted for that by a left-wing faculty and general alum network at Harvard University. So there's a lot to blame conservatives for some.
Okay. Does Ben Shapiro actually think that, like, women have, like, a sharper bell curve for intelligence and IQ than men? For one, IQ is heavily influenced by, like, your upbringing. For example, like, we've done massive, like, meta-analyses that are, like, collections of studies on this that have shown that your zip code can directly correlate to your IQ, even when you control for race. Because I know conservatives will try to say, well, black people have lower IQs on average than white people, so that's weighting the data. Because they always have racism to try to use as a debunk to any data you have to present to them. But yeah, no, literally just like what neighborhood you grew up in, white or black, heavily indicates with a massive amount of reliability, what IQ you are going to have. And not only that, heavily indicates what upbringing and then future you're going to have, where you're going to end up when you're an adult. So This can be like correlated to schooling. It can be correlated to things like the amount of lead that is residual in these communities. For those that don't know, in a lot of cities, the redlined communities had tons of lead paint, tons of lead gasoline, other lead related things because they were cheap and mass produced and heavily bought by lower income communities back then. Basically permanently seeped into the environment. The amount of lead paint, the amount of lead gasoline, all of the lead that was spread has seeped into the earth. And when the kids play and they kick up sand or they play in the dirt and make like, sand castles or whatever, that ends up getting into their systems. If like a baby or a toddler ends up like chipping some bits of paint off the wall or eating something off of the floor, if it hasn't been swept in a long time, or like bits of flecks of paint or small amounts of it has been like seeped into the floor, all it takes is small amounts of lead, based on the studies we've seen, to have massively negative impacts on the IQ and development of children. And obviously, all across America, all through these redlined neighborhoods, the amount of lead in the environment is so much fucking higher than anywhere else. It's insane. Here. Redlining and lead levels chart. Or map, actually. I like the map that shows it. Redlining and lead water pipes. I didn't even know it was the water pipes. Lead pipes and redlining in Boston. As researchers, we began to ask how the Homeowners Loan Corporation's redlining maps, a project recently digitized by researchers at the University of Stanford, might woke institution, guys, we can't trust them, might make individuals more prone to lead pipe risk. With ties to Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville, we sought out to streamline resident research and better understand how redlining might correlate with lead pipe risk. A lifetime of lead exposure is demonstrably linked to inequality, environmental toxicity, and well-being over a lifetime. I like how there is just a link to click on where it says demonstrably linked to inequality, environmental toxicity, and well-being over a lifetime. Literally saying, by the way, that like lead exposure alone is one of the demonstrable factors that has led to inequality. Not racism necessarily, but lead exposure, which of course is a product of racism due to like the redlining and stuff, but still. Ben Shapiro is essentially trying to claim that any acknowledgement of the racialized history of this problem, or of all these problems, is itself a form of racial discrimination and thus racist. It's like a real left-wing destroyed take. Researchers show that housing segregation has been shaped by redlining and lack of investment in low-income neighborhoods, which kept communities of color in places where lead exposure levels are higher. Remember, guys, if you're in a nice neighborhood, something that's likely is the people living in those nicer neighborhoods with very expensive houses is they've got money to remodel, to replace the pipes, to tear down the walls and replace them, and to basically turn, like, how many times in nice neighborhoods have you seen a house just like you just see a new house is getting built? Like gentrification happens even in like the really high income neighborhoods, happening all over Seattle. When you look at older neighborhoods that have been redlined, the houses are like built in the 50s and 60s. You can tell that they still have lead pipes, unless it's a really progressive city where they've mandated like free replacement of the pipes with like copper ones or something. But like, think about it. The only reason those pipes would be replaced a lot of the time is because the homeowner can afford to do so, or there was a local government mandate for a free replacement of those pipes. If you don't have the money to do that, then yeah, you're probably living in a house that has had lead paint, lead pipes, all sorts of lead gasoline, drop the heavy metals into the soil all around where you live, so the dust from wind and whatnot is getting kicked up, and you're just constantly exposed to it in all sorts of different ways. People don't consider these things, but this is one of a million factors that lead to these inequalities that Ben Shapiro really doesn't want to acknowledge, and wants to claim any acknowledgement of is itself racist. Left-wing destroyed.
Surrendering the playing field. I totally agree that conservatives should not have surrendered the playing field in some institutions. Colleges were surrendered a lot earlier than 20 years ago. They were surrendered in the late 1960s, early 1970s.
Yeah, so I think that a couple things. So one of the big issues that I have with kind of like this, I don't know if
Yeah, you know, the colleges were lost in the 1960s when they started rallying together progressive students to fight against segregation. That's when everything really went to shit. It is very clear that, like, there has always been a right and wrong side of history as far as American history goes. And the right has always been on the wrong side, which is ironic based on their name, you know? It's always been those that have fought for liberation, equality, and the destruction of like systems that enforce hierarchy such as segregation, slavery, etc., against people like this who argue it's actually the just natural state of things. People like Ben Shapiro, back when slavery was practiced, argued slavery was the natural state of things, just like Ben Shapiro today argues that the current state of our hierarchy and inequality is the natural state of things. People like Ben have made Ben's arguments about far worse things all throughout history. As these people lose more ground, though, what they are arguing for seems less and less extreme.
we call it era of Trumpism or populism, is this total disregard for institutions and this disconnect from participation in the system. So it's one of the big things that I fight with progressives about, who cares, because they're all 20 years old, they don't vote anyway. But it's another thing that I notice with a lot of people that are...
Hey guys, as much as I want to say it's a deranged take, the current polling shows that the Gen Z is going to win Trump the election by not voting. Like, if the election happened today, Gen Z would win Trump the election by simply not voting for Biden. So, yeah, he's kind of right.
Trump voters, Trump fans, or whatever, is this idea where we say this institution is irrevocably destroyed. It's irredeemable. It can't be saved. Nothing that we do can fix it. And I think that what that leads people to doing is, one, they disconnect further, and then two, there's a general hopelessness when it comes to how society is like ran or structured, such that you fall into that populist brain rot of the only person that can save me is Donald Trump. I can't trust literally anything. And I think that when you start driving people into that direction, all it does is it further amplifies all the problems that you're complaining about. So that's one of the reasons why when we talk about like conservative participation, I want there to be more conservatives that are trying to participate in academia, but I feel like the leading thought or the leading speaking out against it is basically saying it's a waste of time. It's completely lost.
So I think that the alternative to that is that you're seeing on the right a growth of, for example, alternative universities. Saying,
yeah, but that's the worst thing.
No, I don't think so at all. I think competition is a great way of incentivizing.
Alternative universities like PragerU. Yeah, so this is where the core disagreement of like conservatives like Ben Shapiro having, like, they disagree with reality. And so the fact that the curriculum that is taught in the schools is aligned with the current research on the topics that they politically disagree with, and they've made like a culture war issue over, is you'll never be able to find compromise on that. The right is not willing to compromise there. Well, many people on the right are willing to compromise there, because many people on the right are not like maliciously evil, obviously. Ben Shapiro's audience, most of them are not maliciously evil. Ben Shapiro is. His audience are victims of his dishonesty.
Some change on behalf of universities that may have forgotten that there's an entire other side of the aisle in the United States.
No shot. I don't think even you think that.
So first of all, let me make clear.
Go.
I think the entire educational system at the upper levels, if you're not in STEM, is a complete scam. I think it's a complete waste of money. I think it's a complete waste of time. And I think that it's all it is a formalized, very expensive sorting mechanism for people of IQ. That's all.
This can be true depending on what you are able to do. So it's funny that Ben Shapiro says we live in a meritocracy, and yet if you go and you get a degree in something like art, or if you get a degree in literature or writing or something, like something he would consider a throwaway degree that's not STEM, you can't do anything with that in his worldview. You can. There are cases where you can, but in a lot of times it's probably going to be a waste of money. Most people with like those degrees say it's a waste of time. But like the topics that Ben takes the most issue with are STEM things, right? I guess he probably has an issue with like gender studies classes, you know, that's not a STEM class, but like psychology, Ben is against the current consensus of psychology. He is against the curriculum that is taught in psychology classes, like Psychology 101, 102, 103, like all that shit, in colleges. He's against what is taught in those. Biology, he is against what is taught in college biology classes. Economics, he is against what's taught in college economics classes. Like, literally the curriculums these right-wing pundits take issue with.
All it is. People take an SAT, you go to a good school, you take 4 years of bullshit. I know, I did it at UCLA. And then we analyze based on your degree where you should go to law school. I could have gone directly from high school to law school with maybe 1 year of training and then done 1 year of law school and been done. Okay, the reality is that this is a giant scam. And this, again, is a bipartisan problem, but it's just a general.
Was Ben even a successful lawyer? Like, Ben had like multiple hustles he attempted before he settled for conservative liar on the internet. Like, he lies on the internet for a living. Was he really that successful at the other things he did before this?
Generalized problem. We have. You want to talk about things that hurt the lower classes in the United States? The bleeding of degrees up is so wild and crazy. There's so many jobs in the United States that should not require a college degree that we now require a college degree to do, because there was this weird idea that came over Americans where they mistook correlation for causation. They would say, oh, look, people who go to college are making more money than people who don't go to college. Therefore, everyone should go to college. Well, maybe the reason.
Well, no, people who can afford college go to... Okay, the reason why people who go to college make more money is A, generally... Yes, getting a higher education, having a college education, especially nowadays, is a requirement for a lot of jobs, even at an entry level. So it's like, in a lot of cases, the bare minimum nowadays, despite it being harder and harder to obtain. On top of that, if you are able to get into college in the first place and get a degree especially, chances are you are already coming from money. And if you're already coming from money, you have a safety net, A. You're getting financial support, B, most likely, and C, you likely already have generational wealth knowledge. Knowledge is a big part of generational wealth, too. Imagine you don't have parents who know how to balance a checkbook. Imagine you don't have parents who know how to set up an online auto payment for your bills. And all they know how to do is, go pick up a cashier's check and, mail it. That's all they know how to do. Because they never grew up with computers. They don't know how to use a computer, so they don't know how to teach you how. Imagine you have parents who didn't know how to use online banking and thus didn't teach you how. Online banking apps, that's not a thing to you. A computer wasn't afforded or available in your home growing up. Imagine that. Imagine that's the situation. A lot of people have very different upbringings, and that can change things drastically. Dude, imagine how different my life would be if I didn't grow up with a computer. I'm only where I am right now because I grew up with a computer, and I'd be nowhere near I wouldn't be where I am now if I didn't grow up with a lot of computer knowledge and computer time and playing games and being online and learning about the internet and watching YouTube and watching streams, and just having the upbringing I did is why I'm able to do what I do.
Is because people who are going to college were better qualified for particular jobs because, on average, not all the time, but on average, a lot of those people were smarter and making more money because of that. And so all you've done is you've now created these additional layers of stratification. So a person who used to be able to get a job with a college degree now has to have a postdoc degree.
Okay. I'm not really interested in hearing any more of this because this has gone on for an hour and a half now, and I actually do have to wrap up stream. But, you see how Ben Shapiro is relying on strawmans and talking... basically breakneck bullshitting his own audience into thinking he's smarter than them, so they'll trust everything he says. Destiny is doing a very effective method for being platformed by figures like this in not challenging them too hard, but still putting the challenging ideas out there they have to contend with without it being a challenge against you when they contend it. And primarily focusing your rhetoric around pulling their audience into yours so that they can be radicalized by your content, not the debate. I think that's a pretty good strategy. I think it works well. So I'm kind of glad this debate happened because I imagine a bunch of Ben Shapiro fans are probably going to get pulled over somewhat left, further left. And, that's a good thing in my book for all the problems I have with Destiny, of which I have many.